Della Rourke was told to keep her eyes on the spittoons, not the ledger. So when the cattleman laughed at the saloon girl correcting their tab, she didn't flush. She just said the true number, $4,180.40 to the cent, and turned away. Prewitt snapped his book shut. A saloon girl doesn't do sums. She does what she's paid for. 40 men heard it. Della, quiet. Then your book's short $278, sir, and the freight's billed twice. Across the smoke, Cassius Thorne, richest brand in the territory, note due at the bank, stopped mid-drink and looked at her the way a man looks at rescue. He came back the next night. And the next. If you've ever been judged by your apron instead of your mind, this story is for you. Subscribe and comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far Della's tally travels. Bishop's Ford sat in the third dry summer that anyone cared to count. The creek had gone to a thread. The hills west of town wore the color of old rope. Dust came off the wagon road and hung in the air like it had nowhere better to be. Folks said the rain would come. Folks had been saying it for 2 years. The Gilded Spur stood on the corner of Front and Cutter, and it was the one building in town that still looked like money. Josephine Kettle saw to that. Fresh sawdust every morning. Glass behind the bar, polished till it threw the lamplight back. A long mirror that made the room look twice as full as it ever was. Joe believed a man drank more where the floor was swept. She was usually right. Della Rourke worked the room from 4 in the afternoon until the last chair went up. She was 24. She wore a gray dress and a white apron, and she kept her hair pinned back so it stayed out of the trays. She moved quiet. She listened more than she spoke. And she never wrote a single figure down. That was the thing people missed about her. They saw the apron and thought they had the whole of her. They didn't. Joe trusted Della with the house. Not the till a girl could dip. The whole ledger of it. What came in, what went out, what each man owed, and what he'd paid, and what he was good for. Joe said it plain, more than once, to anyone who wondered why she leaned so hard on a server. Della keeps them behind her eyes, she'd say. Not in a book some drunk can knock off the bar and read out loud. A number in Della's head is safer than a number in a locked drawer. There was a reason for that, though Della never gave it. She never trusted the marks in a ledger. Not since her father's. She kept the reason where she kept everything, behind her eyes, where no one could get at it. So she carried the whole house in her mind. 40 tabs on a busy night, running and shifting, and she never lost the thread of one. A man would order his 4th whiskey, and she'd already have the sum waiting when he asked. She was never wrong. Not by a nickel. It was the one thing in her life she was sure of, and she held it close, like a coal you keep alive through a cold night. The men liked her. That was a careful thing. They liked her the way they liked a good horse, as a thing that served them well. Few of them looked past the tray. She'd learned not to want them to. Wanting was a door, and doors let in the cold. Now the biggest brand in the county was Thorne's Reach. Everybody knew it. The T-Bar T ran cattle from the river clear to the north benches. Cassius Thorne had built it, or driven it up out of the ground with his own arms. The story shifted depending on who told it. He was 35, and he wore his money like a man who'd earned it and never forgot the earning. He came into town rarely. When he did, he came like weather. What most of the room didn't know, and what a few did, was that Thorne's Reach was not as solid as the brand made it look. The drought had thinned the herd. Every steer that died in the dry was money walking off into the sagebrush, and the Cattleman's Bank of Bishop's Ford held a note against the Reach. $6,000. Due in 30 days. $6,000 in that country, in that year, was a fortune that could bury a man. The note was a stone tied to Thorne's neck, and the water was rising, and he knew it even if his face never let on. He came into the Gilded Spur on a Thursday, in the worst heat of July. Della was carrying a tray of empties when the doors swung. She felt the room change before she turned. Men sat up. A card game went quiet a beat. Thorne crossed the floor like the floor belonged to him, which, in a sense it did. He could have bought the building and never noticed the coin leave his pocket. He set his hat on the bar. He asked for whiskey, the good bottle, and he didn't say please, and he didn't need to. Jo poured it herself. Thorne drank standing up. He looked at the room the way a man looks at a thing beneath him. Not cruel. Exactly. Just certain. The saloon was a place he passed through. The people in it were part of the furniture. When he was done, he laid a silver dollar on the bar for a drink that cost him 35 cents, and he turned to go, and he expected the change to stay where it fell, the way a big man leaves a big coin, so everyone can see he doesn't stoop for the difference. Della counted it out. She did it without thinking, the way she did everything with numbers. 35 from 100 is 65. She stacked it on the bar in front of him, a $50, a dime, a nickel, 65 cents, exact, and she set the last coin down with a small click and said, "Your change, Mr. Thorne." The room half heard it. Two men grinned, waiting to see the Baron wave it off. Thorne looked down at the little stack of silver. Then, he looked at her. It was the first time he'd looked at her at all, really looked, past the apron. Something moved behind his eyes and was gone. "Keep it," he said. "It's not mine to keep," Della said. "It's yours." "I only counted it." She picked up her tray and walked back into the room and left the 65 cents sitting there. She didn't flush. She didn't wait to see what he'd do. She had 4 other tables and a running sum for each one, and she was already back inside her own head where it was quiet. Behind her, Thorne stood a moment longer than a man like him should have. Then, he scooped the coins into his palm without a word and put them in his pocket. It was the smallest thing. It was the first centimeter of a very long road, and neither of them knew it yet. He had not come alone. Elias Prewitt kept the books for Thorne's reach. He was a narrow man, 40 or so, with ink on his fingers and a way of holding his mouth like he'd tasted something and disapproved. He'd followed Thorne in and taken a chair at the end of the long table, and he'd set his ledger down in front of him, a fat black book with a strap, and he'd been watching the room over the top of it. He had watched Della count out the change. He had not liked it. There was a reason Prewitt didn't like it, though it would be a while before anyone but Della had the shape of it. A man who fakes his sums on paper does not enjoy the sight of a woman doing them true in her head. It's a mirror, and it shows him a thing he'd rather not see. Toward 9, the tally for the Reach's table needed settling. It always did. Thorne stood a table for the men who rode for him, or the men he wanted something from, and the drinks ran deep. Prewitt kept the count. That was his job, to keep the count and hand Thorne the figure so Thorne could pay it and move on to bigger arithmetic than whiskey. Prewitt read his number off the book. He said it a touch too loud, so the room would hear that the Reach kept proper accounts. $3,902, 15 cents, he said. "The season's tab, gentlemen, settled tonight." Now that was not the whiskey alone. That was the whole running account between the Reach and the Gilded Spur across the summer. Freight the Spur had fronted, supplies, the standing tab, all of it rolled into one. The way big outfits and the houses they used did their business by the season instead of the drink. It was a large number, and Prewitt said it like a large number, with weight, so everyone would know the man who could speak it was a serious man. Della was passing the end of the table with an armful of glasses. She heard the number. And the number was wrong. She knew it the way you know a false note in a hymn, not by working it, just by the wrongness of it landing in the ear. She'd carried that account behind her eyes all summer. She had every line of it, every freight bill, and every case of the good bottle, and every keg. And Prewitt's number was short. It was short by a lot. She should have kept walking. She knew that even as she stopped. A server does what she's paid for, and reading a rich man's book out loud in front of 40 men was not on the list of things Della Rourke was paid to do. But she stopped. Half to herself, low, hardly meant for anyone, she said. That freight's billed twice. She wasn't even sure she'd said it out loud until Prewitt's head came around. What did you say? The table quieted a notch. Not all the way. Just enough. Della felt the eyes. She set her glasses down on the near end of the table, careful, because they were Joe's and they were glass. And she straightened up. Nothing, sir, she said. The account's your business. But Prewitt had heard the wrongness in her voice, the certainty, and it stung him worse than an accusation. He snapped the ledger shut with a crack that turned more heads. A saloon girl, he said, does not do sums. She does what she's paid for. Fetch the whiskey, girl, and leave the figures to men who keep them. It went out across the room like a stone across a pond. 40 men heard it. The card game had stopped for real now. Joe, behind the bar, went very still, and her hand found the rag and stopped moving it. Della saw all of that in half a second, and she saw, too, the thing that always happened next, the small laughter of men who liked to see a woman put in her place, the little grins already starting. She had a choice. She knew both roads. One was to pick up her glasses and go, and let the number stay wrong, and keep the wall of her station between herself and the cold. That was the safe road. She'd walked it 100 times. The other road she had never once taken. And she took it now, and she never could say afterward exactly why, except that the number was wrong, and she was the only person in the room who knew how wrong. And there is a limit to how long a person can pretend not to be the thing they are. His book says $3,902.15, Della said. Her voice wasn't loud, but she'd learned to carry a room from the back of it, and it carried. The true tab is $4,180.40. Somebody laughed. One bark. Then it died, because of the way she'd said the cents. Nobody guesses to the cent. The difference, Della went on, and now she was inside the numbers and the room fell away the way it always did, is $278.25. And that's because the freight from the June haul is entered twice in his book, once on the 9th and once on the 17th. Same load, same weight, same charge. $60 of it is the double. The rest is short-counted across the standing tab, a little at a time, so it wouldn't show. She paused. You can check the 9th against the 17th. It's the same bill written in 2 places. The silence that followed was a different kind than the one before. The first quiet had been men waiting to laugh. This one was men doing sums of their own, figuring what it meant that a server had just read a bookkeeper's ledger inside out without touching it. Prewitt's face had gone the color of tallow. This is absurd, he said. You cannot possibly open it, Della said. The 9th. And the 17th. He did not open it. That told the room more than opening it would have, and Cassius Thorne, who had been standing at the bar with his second whiskey untouched in his hand, set the glass down. He was not looking at her the way the other men were. The other men were looking at a saloon girl who'd made a fool of a bookkeeper, which was sport, and would be a story by morning. Thorne was looking at something else. He was looking at a mind that had just moved faster than the man he paid a salary to keep his books. He was looking at it the way a drowning man looks at a rope thrown from the bank, not with wanting, exactly, with recognition. With the first, careful, unwilling hope that the thing that might save him had just walked past his table with an armful of glasses. He did not say anything. That was not his way. Not then. But he did not go back to his whiskey either. He watched Della pick up Joe's glasses and carry them to the bar, and he watched her the whole way, and when she set them down and turned, he was still watching, and for one moment she met his eyes across the smoke and the lamplight, and then she looked away and went back to her tables. Prewitt gathered his ledger and his hat and left without settling anything. Nobody stopped him, but everybody watched him go. Later, when the room had thinned and Joe was counting the till, she looked at Della sideways and said, "Lo, you know what you did tonight." "I know," Della said. "That man keeps books for the biggest brand in the county." "That man keeps them badly," Della said, "or keeps them crooked, and I'd lay money it's crooked, because nobody bills the same freight twice by accident." She wiped down the bar. "But it's not my business, Joe. I said too much." Joe didn't argue. But she looked at Della a while longer, and there was something in her face that was half worry and half pride, and she said only, "Sleep. Girl, it'll all still be here tomorrow." It was, and so was he. Thorne came back the next night. He didn't sit at the long table. He took a stool at the end of the bar, near where Della worked, and he ordered one whiskey and made it last, and he watched the room. When she passed near him, he said, without preamble, if a man borrows $200 at 8% and pays it back in 90 days, what does he owe over the principal? Della didn't slow down. $3.94, she said, if you count the 90 days honest. $4 even if the bank rounds the month up, which it will. She kept walking. Thorne almost smiled. Almost, he came back the night after that. And the one after that. It became a thing the room got used to, the cattle baron at the end of the bar, nursing one drink, throwing figures at the server like a man skipping stones. He never made it easy. He'd give her a tangle on purpose, so many steers at so much ahead, lest the ones lost to the dry, freight at one rate to the railhead, and another beyond it, interest running underneath the whole thing. He'd give it to her fast and half mumbled and expect her to lose the thread. She never lost the thread. She'd answer before his cigar ash fell. He told himself it was a curiosity, a diversion in a hard month. He told himself a great many things in those weeks, and later he'd be honest about none of them being true. One night, he pulled a stub of carpenter's pencil from his vest to note a figure on the back of a bill of sale, flat, red, chewed at one end. The kind a man uses to mark lumber. He'd borrowed it off a hand at the yard and never given it back. He wrote his number, and then he sat turning the little stub in his fingers while he talked, and when he left he put it in his pocket without thinking. And it stayed there. A carpenter's pencil in a rich man's vest. He forgot he had it. It would be a while before that pencil mattered, but it had started to travel. Bishop's Ford noticed things, a town that dry has nothing to do but notice. Mrs. Adelaide Vance noticed the most of all. She was the banker's widow, and she'd been the arbiter of who was who in that town for 20 years, and she had a daughter, Cordelia, of marriageable age and impeccable manners and no particular fire in her at all. Mrs. Vance had views on where a man like Thorne ought to spend his evenings, and the Gilded Spur was not among them, and the server at the Gilded Spur was somewhere below the sawdust in her accounting. So Mrs. Vance began to steer. An invitation to supper. Cordelia placed just so at the church social. A word here and a word there about how a man of standing needed a wife of standing. A proper woman. A settled woman. One who knew the difference between a parlor and a barroom. The rules of the town, wearing a widow's face and a mother's smile, went to work. Thorne felt the pressure. He was not a fool about it. He knew what the county expected of him. He knew, too, that the note was due, and that a banker's widow's goodwill was worth having when a man owed the bank $6,000 in a dry year. He sat through the suppers. He was civil to Cordelia, who was easy to be civil to and impossible to remember an hour later. And he went back to the Gilded Spur and set his figures on the bar and watched a saloon girl solve them faster than his own bookkeeper could fake them. The note came due closer. 20 days. Then 15. Thorne had gone over his books with Prewitt twice, and twice the numbers hadn't closed the way they should, and Prewitt had explanations for all of it. The drought, the freight, the shrinking herd, 100 small drains that a bad year opened up. The explanations were smooth. They were always smooth. But Thorne lay awake at night in the big empty house at the Reach and did his own reckoning in the dark, and the reckoning kept coming up wrong, and he couldn't find where. He knew a mind that could find it. He fought the idea for the better part of a week. A man of his standing did not carry his private books into a saloon and set them in front of a server. It broke every rule the county lived by. It would be talked about. It would give Mrs. Vance and every long tongue in Bishop's Ford a season's worth of matter. And there was pride in it, too. The plain male pride of not wanting to admit that the thing that might save him was a woman in an apron whom his own bookkeeper had told to fetch the whiskey. But 15 days is 15 days. And a drowning man does not, in the end, care about the standing of the hand that reaches him. He came to the Spur on a Sunday, when it was near empty, in the flat gold light of a late afternoon. He didn't take his stool at the bar. He waited until Della had a clear moment, and then he said, quiet, so no one else could hear, "Miss Rourke, I've a thing to ask you, and I'd ask you to hear it out before you answer." Della looked at him. It was the first time he'd called her by her name. "My books are wrong," Thorne said. "I've a note due at the bank in 15 days, and I can't make my own accounts close, and the man I pay to keep them tells me it's the drought, and I've stopped believing him." He said it plain, without softening it, which cost him something. You read Prewitt's tab in one look and named the double freight before he could close the cover. "I've spent 3 weeks watching you do sums no man in this county could do." He paused. "I'd like you to look at my books. The real ones. At the Reach. I'll pay you fair for the time." The room was quiet. Somewhere out back a hen fussed. Della should have said no. Every wall she'd built said no. A server did not go out to a baron's ranch and sit at his desk. That was the kind of thing that ended a woman in a town like this, no matter how honest the reason. And there was the older wall. The one she never spoke of. The wall that kept her hands off other men's ledgers, because the last ledger she'd trusted had been her father's, and her father's had been a lie that took everything. "Why me?" she said. It came out before she could stop it. "Because you're the only person I've met," Thorne said, "who sees a number the way I see a horse. All at once. And whole." He turned his hat in his hands. "And because I've run out of men I can trust with it, and I find I trust you, and I can't tell you why, and it's not comfortable for me to say so." That was more honesty than she'd had from any man in years. She was quiet a long moment. Then she said, "I'll come Tuesday. Daylight. And I'll want your bookkeeper's ledgers and every freight bill and bank draft you've got, not a fair copy. The real paper. If I can't see the real paper, I can't tell you anything. You'll have all of it," Thorne said. "And, Mr. Thorne," she met his eyes, "if I find what I think I'll find, you may not thank me for it." "I'll thank you for the truth," he said. "I've had enough of the other thing." She came Tuesday. The ranch office at Thorne's Reach was a plain room off the main house, a big desk, a wall of shelved ledgers, a window that looked west toward the dry benches where the herd was thin. He'd laid it all out for her the way she'd asked: Prewitt's books, the loose freight bills spiked on a nail, the bank drafts in a leather folder. He'd meant to hover. She'd asked him not to. So he sat across the desk and was quiet and watched her work, and it was the strangest afternoon of his life. She took off her gloves. She hadn't planned to, but paper is a thing you read with your hands as much as your eyes, and she wanted the corners of the pages under her fingers. Thorne noticed her bare hands on the ledger and looked away, and then looked back. She started at the beginning of the season and went forward, line by line, and she did not write anything down. He watched for that, and it unsettled him, that she carried it all in her head, that the sums stacked up behind her eyes where he couldn't see them, that she'd turn a page and her lips would move for half a second and then go still, and she'd turn the next one. An hour went by. The light shifted on the floor. He got up once to bring the freight bills off the nail when she asked, and setting them down beside her, he was close enough to smell the plain soap of her and see the small line between her brows where the numbers gathered. And he stepped back too quickly, and she didn't seem to notice, and he was glad and sorry both. She found her way into the thing slowly. She could feel it under the paper, the way she'd felt the wrongness in Prewitt's number that first night, a false note, running quiet under the hymn. It was there. It had a shape. It threaded through the standing accounts a little at a time, small enough that no single line would flag it, but she wasn't reading single lines. She was reading the whole, all at once, the way he'd said. And the hole didn't close. The light was going amber when she finally sat back. Cassius, she said. She didn't mean to use his given name. It came out of her the way the pencil left him, without deciding. And it landed in the quiet room and stayed there, and something in the ice between them cracked 1 clean degree, and they both heard it, and neither of them touched it. "You'd best sit," she said, "and you'd best send your bookkeeper away from this house before I show you what I've found. Because it's here. It's threaded all through the season. Somebody's been bleeding this ranch a little at a time, all summer, and covering it in the very book you pay him to keep." Thorne sat. Outside, the last light was going off the dry benches, and the note was 14 days from due. And somewhere between the town and the reach, a narrow man with ink on his fingers was going about his evening, not yet knowing that a woman in an apron had just read, in a single afternoon, the whole of what he'd spent a summer hiding, and had not yet even reached the worst of it. Thorne sat, and for a long while he said nothing. Della laid it out for him plain. She turned the ledger so the lamplight caught the columns. She showed him the June freight, billed once in the front of the book and again in the back, under a different hauler's name that didn't exist. She showed him the standing tab that ran short a little each week, 35 cents here, 65 there, small coins nobody counts twice. She showed him the true figure against the written one, $4,180.40, and the book said $3,902.15, $278.25. Gone into a narrow man's pocket, a season at a time. "That's this book," she said. "That's the freight and the tab." But he didn't stop there. "Look here." She walked him through the rest. The stock accounts, the feed drafts, the little bleed threaded through all of it, so quiet you'd never hear it unless you held the whole book behind your eyes at once. By the time she finished, the amber was gone from the window, and the lamp was doing all the work, and Thorne's face had gone the color of the paper. "How much?" he said. "More than the skim." He's been careful. But careful men leave a shape, and the shape is here. She touched the page. "Recover the doubled freight. Hold him to the true tab. Then take that leather folder there, and the draft the bank offered you in the spring, and renegotiate at the 8% instead of letting it balloon. You close the note, Cassius. You close it with 2 weeks to spare." He looked at the folder on the desk. He looked at her. "You did that in an afternoon," he said, "in your head. What he couldn't do all summer with a book and a desk and my money." "He could do it," Della said. "He just didn't want you to." Outside, the drought went on. Inside, something else did too. She stayed past propriety that night. She knew it, and she stayed. Joe would ask, and she'd have no good answer, and she stayed anyway. Thorne lit a second lamp. He brought her coffee gone bitter on the stove, and she drank it without complaint. And they worked the season's accounts down to the last line by the light of 2 lamps, side by side, close enough that when he reached to turn a page his sleeve brushed her wrist, and neither of them moved for a breath too long. When she rose to go, the night had turned cold the way desert nights do. He took his coat off the hook and laid it over her shoulders without a word. She let him. That was the whole of it. A coat, laid down. But she felt the weight of it all the way back to town, and she thought about how a thing like that could ruin a woman, and she thought she didn't care, and that frightened her more than the numbers ever had. The days after went quiet and strange. Thorne came to the Gilded Spur still, but not to test her now. He came and sat and watched the door and waited for her shift to slow, and when it did he'd set some small figure in front of her, not because he doubted the answer, but because the asking was the only language he had. She knew it. She let him have it. A merchant's daughter knows the difference between a man buying and a man reaching. Jo watched all of it with her arms folded. "You know what he is," Jo said one night, wiping down the long table where 40 men had laughed, "and you know what you are. Not because I say it. Because they do." "I know," Della said. "He's got a widow steering a proper girl at him with both hands. Cordelia Vance. Manners like church silver, and a bank that could take his whole brand in a month." Jo set the rag down. "There's no floor under this, Della. There's just the drop." "I know that too. Then keep your eyes open." "I always do," Della said. "That's the trouble." But she didn't stop. She'd chosen already, back in that office by the 2 lamps, though she wouldn't have called it choosing. She'd found the thing that could save him, and she couldn't unfind it. And a woman who saves a man she can't marry has already told the truth about her heart, whatever her mouth says after. Mrs. Adelaide Vance had ruled the manors of Bishop's Ford for 20 years, and she did not rule by missing things. She saw the coat. Somebody always sees the coat. She saw the Baron's horse at the Gilded Spur 4 nights of 6, and she did the arithmetic that mattered to her, which was the arithmetic of who belonged where. And she moved. She moved the way water moves toward the low ground, without hurry and without mercy, and she brought her daughter to the front of every gathering, and she let a word drop here and a word drop there, until the town had a story it liked better than the truth. The story was this. A saloon girl had gotten her hooks into a great man in his hour of trouble. A clever one. Too clever, the kind of clever that ought to make an honest county nervous. Elias Prewitt heard that story and knew a gift when it fell in his lap. He'd spent a fortnight sweating. He knew Thorne had stopped believing him. He knew the woman in the apron had been to the reach and had sat with the books, and a man who steals with a pen knows exactly how naked a book can leave him. He'd been waiting for the axe, and instead, the town handed him away to swing it first. The Cattlemen's Association held its summer dinner on a Thursday, in the worst heat of July. They held it in the long hall behind the bank, the same 40 men and their wives, the ones who owned the water rights and the brands and the notes that hung over other men's necks. Thorne was there, because he had to be. His note came due in 9 days, and every man in that room knew it, and a man who misses the dinner in the season he might lose everything has already lost the room. So he came. And because Jo had been asked to cater the tables, Della came too, in her apron, carrying plates, keeping her eyes down, doing what she was paid for. That was Prewitt's opening, and he took it standing. He rose between the roast and the coffee, tapped his glass, and begged the room's pardon for a matter of business at a social hour. He said it grieved him. He said he'd held his tongue as long as honor allowed. Then, he told them. He told them a woman had been let into Mr. Thorne's private books, a server, a saloon girl with no schooling and no name worth the saying. And he asked the room whether they knew where such a woman came from. He let the question hang. Then he answered it himself. "Her name is Rourke," he said. "Della Rourke. And some of you grayheads will remember a grain house that failed back east a dozen years gone, and the man who ran it into the ground, and the accusation that followed him to his grave. Fraud, gentlemen. Books cooked. Creditors ruined. He turned, slow, so the whole hall could see his face be sorry. That man was her father. And that daughter has spent a summer with her hands in the accounts of the biggest brand in this county. I leave you to your own sums." The hall went very still. Della stood at the sideboard with a coffee pot going cold in her fist. She did not drop it. She did not flush the way she hadn't flushed the first night, when they laughed. She just felt the old wall come up out of the ground, where it had always been. The one she'd told herself was real, so it could never surprise her, and here it was, real after all. Mrs. Vance rose into the silence like she'd been waiting at the bottom of it. "Well," she said, "just that, to start." Then she gathered the room the way she'd gathered rooms for 20 years. She spoke of standards. She spoke of what a great house owed itself. She spoke of her own dear Cordelia, raised proper, raised safe, and how a man of Mr. Thorne's position in an hour of such trial deserved the steadiness of his own kind, not the cleverness of a girl who'd learned her figures in a bankrupt's back room. She never once raised her voice. She didn't have to. The gate was already closing, and she was only naming the shape of it, and every eye in the hall turned to Thorne. He stood at the head table with his note 9 days from due and 40 men around him who could call it. His whole empire hung on the goodwill in that room. One word from him. That was all it needed. One word to name the truth, that this woman had saved his brand. That Prewitt was the thief, and the book would prove it. One word. He hesitated. It was not long. A breath. 2. A man doing sums of his own, the cost of the room against the cost of his soul, and finding for one terrible moment that he did not know the answer. But Della was watching, and Della read that hesitation the way she read a ledger, whole and at once, and she knew what it meant before he did. It meant the wall was real. She set the coffee pot down on the sideboard. Quiet, she took off her apron, folded it once, laid it beside the pot. Then she crossed the hall to the long table, and she reached into her skirt pocket, and she took out the stub of Carpenter's pencil, flat and red, chewed at one end. The one he'd borrowed a month ago and forgotten to give back, the one she'd kept without asking why. She set it on the white cloth in front of him. "The tab was free, Mr. Thorne," she said. Her voice carried. She made it carry. "Every sum I gave you, I gave. I never billed a man for the truth, and I won't start by begging you to say it out loud. You know what's in your book. You know whose hand put it there." She looked once, only once, at Prewitt, and the narrow man could not hold it. "The rest is yours to close. I'm sure the gentleman with the ink on his fingers will help you." Then she walked out. Head up. No tears. Into the dry black heat of the July night, and down the road to the Gilded Spur, and she told Joe she'd be on the morning coach, and Joe, who had warned her, didn't say a word about the warning. Joe just held her, once, hard, the way you hold someone who did the right thing and got the wrong for it. Thorne let her go. That was the truth of it, and he made himself sit with it. He let her walk out of that hall, and he stood there while Mrs. Vance's voice filled the space she'd left, and he did not stop her. He went home to the Reach that night, and he did not sleep. He sat in the office with the wall of shelved ledgers and the single lamp, and he was more alone than the note or the drought had ever made him. And somewhere before dawn, being a man who trusted books over instinct his whole life long, he did the only thing he knew how to do with a wound. He opened the book, and he checked her figures himself. It took him till the sun was up over the dry benches. He was slow where she'd been quick. He used the pencil? No, the pencil was gone. She'd left it, and he couldn't make himself touch it yet, so he used another. He worked the June freight. Billed once. Billed twice. There it was, plain as a fence post now that he knew to look. He worked the standing tab. Short 35 cents, short 65, week on week, a season of small coins. He worked the stock accounts and the feed drafts and the whole quiet bleed of it. Every figure landed exactly where she'd said it would. $278.25 skimmed clean. The doubled freight recoverable. The draft renegotiable at the 8%. The note closable with room to spare. She'd read it true. All of it. In a single afternoon, in her head, sitting in his office in an apron he'd been ashamed to be seen near. And her father. He looked at that too, in the cold light. A grain house failed a dozen years gone. A man accused, but Thorne had read enough books now to know the difference between a man who cooks accounts and a man whose accounts were cooked around him. Prewitt had shown him that difference all summer without meaning to. A guilty book hides its shape. An honest one just fails. He didn't know the whole of the Rourke story, but he knew Della had never once given him a false number. And he knew what Prewitt was, and he trusted the reckoning now the way he should have trusted it in the hall. He sent for Prewitt at 4 in the afternoon. The narrow man came expecting to be paid off, or thanked, or both. He found Thorne at the office desk with the fat black ledger open and the freight bills off the nail and laid out in a row. "Sit," Thorne said. Prewitt sat. Thorne turned the book around, the way she had. "June freight," he said. "Read me this line." Prewitt read it. His voice was steady. He was a careful man. "Now read me this one." Thorne's finger, in the back of the book. The same load, a hauler that didn't exist. "That's your hand, Elias, both of them. I've got a fortnight of your letters to set beside it if you'd like to argue the loops of your own G's." The careful man's face came apart slow, the way a bank of dry earth gives before it slides. "She's a swindler's daughter," Prewitt said. "You'd take her word." "I took her word," Thorne said. "And then I took a pencil and checked it, which is more than I ever did for yours. Every figure she gave me is in this book, and every figure you gave me is a lie. And the only swindler I've found this summer is sitting in my chair with my ink still on his fingers." He closed the book. $278.25, Elias. A season of it. Coin by coin, out of a house that fed you. Prewitt had nothing. For the first time all summer, the man who lived by the marks in a ledger had no mark to make. The association met again the following Thursday. They always met again. The county's business didn't stop for a scandal. It fed on one and moved along. They gathered in the same long hall, the same 40 men, Mrs. Vance at her table with Cordelia beside her in pale blue, dutiful and quiet and wishing, though nobody asked her, to be almost anywhere else. Thorne halted the morning coach to bring Della back. He wrote it down himself before it left, and he stood in the road with his hat in his hand, which no man in that county had seen him do, and he asked her. Not for forgiveness. He didn't insult her with that. He asked her to come to the hall one more time and stand where she'd been shamed and let the truth be said in the same room that had swallowed the lie. He said she owed the town nothing. He said he owed it everything, and that he meant to pay in front of witnesses, or not at all. Della looked at him a long moment. "You hesitated," she said. "I did. In front of all of them. When it was mine to lose, I did," he said again. He didn't reach for an excuse. That was the thing that turned her in the end. A lesser man would have explained. He just stood in the road and let the worst of himself be true out loud. "I spent my whole life trusting the room, Della. It took me one night without you to learn the room was always the thing worth the least. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to come watch me be right for once. After that, you can get on any coach you like, and I'll pay the fare." She got down off the coach. The hall went quiet when she came in on his arm, in a plain dress, no apron now. Prewitt was there, sent for, standing under the eye of the sheriff by the door. Mrs. Vance's chin came up. Cordelia's did not. Thorne did not make a speech. He was no good at speeches, and he knew it. He laid 2 ledgers on the long white table instead, side by side, in front of the 40 men who'd laughed once and gone quiet once, and now didn't know which they'd do. "Prewitt's book," he said, and set his hand on the fat black one. And her tally. His hand on nothing, on the air above the second, because the second book was only what she'd carried behind her eyes, and he'd had to write it down himself to have a thing to lay there. You heard a story in this hall last week. I'm going to read you the arithmetic instead. You gentlemen are fond of arithmetic. It's the one thing in this county that can't be taught manners. And he read it. Out loud. The doubled freight, the short-counted tab, the skim, coin by coin, $278.25, the true seasonal figure against the false one. 4,180 and 40 against 3,902.15. He read the draft renegotiated and the note closed with days to spare. He read the whole of what she'd found in an afternoon, and he named, at the end of it, the hand that had hidden it. Every ledger in this room was wrong until she read it, Thorne said. He looked around at them, slow, the way she'd taught him without teaching him anything. You can keep your figures, gentlemen. You can keep your standards and your proper matches and your 20 years of manners. I'll keep her mind. He turned to Della. And the woman it belongs to, if she'll have a man who was slow to say so. The hall did not breathe. I don't come back for the whiskey, Della, he said, quiet now, just to her, though every ear in the county strained to catch it. I never did. I came back for the one thing worth coming back for. Be my partner. In name. In the accounts. In the whole of it. Before all of them, so none of them can ever say it was done in a corner. Della stood in the hush. She did not perform for them. That was the thing Joe would tell people after, again and again, how the girl they'd meant to break did not weep, and did not flush, and did not make a picture of herself for the room. She reached out instead, and she took the stub of carpenter's pencil off the white cloth, where it had sat a week. He'd left it there, couldn't move it, and the servingman had cleaned around it like it was set in stone, and she held it in her fist. You forgot to give this back, she said. I know, Thorne said. A borrowed thing carries interest. Mr. Thorne, $200 at 8%, a man learns to mind what he owes. Then, I'm ruined, he said, because I owe you the whole of it and I mean to pay for the rest of my life. She let the corner of her mouth go, at last. The first crack of it the room had seen. Yes, she said. That was the whole of her answer. One word, the way she'd named the true number that first night. Yes, and the 40 men who had laughed at a saloon girl doing sums rose up out of their chairs, not all at once, but one, and then another, and then the rest, until the whole hall was standing for her. The reckonings came after, each in its turn. Prewitt the sheriff took by the arm, and the doubled freight was his own signature, and the letters would seat a jury without her ever taking the stand. He went out of the hall a narrow man with ink on his fingers and nothing left to write, and the last anyone in Bishop's Ford heard, he was doing sums for the territory now, in a room with a lock on it, and getting no thanks for those either. Mrs. Adelaide Vance's mouth worked and found nothing. That was the thing that undid her in the end, and the town remembered it long after. 20 years of always having the last word, and she stood in that hall with her chin up and her arithmetic of who belonged where crumbling under her, and the words would not come. There was no rule left to name. The great man had chosen the apron over the church silver, in public, with the figures on the table to prove the apron right. And a rule that everyone has watched break is not a rule anymore. It's just a widow, standing. Cordelia touched her mother's sleeve. Mama, she said, gentle, let's sit down. And there was something in the girl's face that was not sorrow at all. Relief, plain and quiet. She'd been offered a marriage she never wanted to a man who never wanted her, and now the cup had passed, and she'd get to choose her own fire someday, or her own peace, whichever she pleased. She sat her mother down. She was kinder about it than the county deserved. And Thorne took the pencil stub from Della's hand, one last time. You'll want this back, he said. But not this one. This one's paid its debt. He reached into his coat and brought out a thing wrapped in cloth, and he unwrapped it there on the table, and it was a pen. Silver and heavy and engraved along the barrel, and beside it a fresh ledger, bound and clean, and he turned it so the room could read the spine. Thorne and Rourke. Stock and accounts. A merchant's daughter told me once she never trusted the marks in a book, he said. Not since her father's. So I thought I'd give her a book that was hers. You can write in it or not, Della. That's yours to say now. But your name's on the spine either way. And it's staying there. Della looked at the pen a long moment. Then she picked it up. And she opened the clean book to its first white page, and under the eyes of the 40 men and the widow and the sheriff and the man who'd come back for her mind, she wrote a figure down at last. The first she'd trusted to paper in a dozen years. It was the true tab, $4,180.40. She wrote it in a clean merchant's hand, and she wrote the false figure beside it, and she drew one line between them, and the line said everything a summer of coins had tried to hide. Then she closed the book. Because now it was hers, and a book that's yours you can trust to keep the thing you know, even when a drunk could spill it, even when a clerk could cook it, even when a whole county would rather it read the other way. A year on, the rain came back. It came the way it does after a run of dry years, all at once and too much, and then just enough, and the benches greened, and the herd at Thorne's Reach thickened, and the note at the Cattleman's Bank of Bishop's Ford was long closed, and the leather folder of drafts hung on a nail, gathering honest dust. The Reach was solvent. It stayed that way, because a house keeps its money when someone reads the whole book behind her eyes and won't be fooled by a coin. Della kept the ranch's accounts openly now, and half the county's besides. That was the part the town took the longest to swallow and then couldn't do without. The men who'd told her to mind the spittoons brought their tallies to her porch, hat in hand, because their own books wouldn't close, and hers always did. She reckoned cattle money and freight bills and interest at 8% for the same grayheads who'd gone quiet at Prewitt's story, and she charged them fair. And she never once billed a man twice, and they knew it, and that was worth more than manners in a dry country. In the evenings the lamp went on the porch table. The ledger lay open between two chairs, hers and his, and they worked it together the way they'd worked it that first night, by two lamps, close, gloves off, and now no wall under them at all. Just the porch boards, and the greening land, and the long habit of two people who trusted the same numbers. He'd set a silver dollar down some nights, out of the old teasing, and she'd count him back his exact change to the cent and set it on the table between them. It wasn't a wound anymore. It was a thing they shared, the way you share a story only two people know the whole of. Mrs. Vance came up the road one autumn evening, stiff as a fence post, with a paper in her gloved hand. A loan. A bit of her late husband's money she wanted put to interest, and no one in the county she trusted to figure it honest, but the one woman she'd tried hardest to break. Pride is a strong thing. Need is stronger. She stood at the bottom of the porch steps and would not come up them, and she asked, in as few words as 20 years of manners could be boiled down to, what the arithmetic would cost her. Della looked up from the ledger. The lamp caught the small line between her brows where the numbers gathered. "The tally's $1, Mrs. Vance," she said. "The truth's still free." And she did the widow's figures right there, fair and exact, and handed them down the steps, and Mrs. Vance took them and went, and the two things had been settled between them without either being said, which is the only way that kind of thing ever gets settled. The lamp burned down, the land lay dark and finally wet. And on the spine of the book between the two chairs, where anyone passing could read it, the letters caught the light, Thorne and Rourke, together, in a hand that no drunk could spill and no clerk could cook, and no county could ever again tell to keep its eyes on the spittoons and off the ledger. A mind can't be kept behind an apron forever. Sooner or later, if it's real, it reads the whole book, and then it writes its own name on the spine. Comment the town you're watching from, friends. I'd like to know how far Della's tally has traveled.